Welcome to Deduction Junction, where mysteries unfold and every detail holds a clue. Step into the brilliant mind of Hercule Poirot, the world's greatest detective, as we journey through his most intriguing cases. With logic sharper than a razor and an eye for the smallest detail, Poirot unravels crimes that leave others baffled. Get ready to immerse yourself in a world of suspense, deception, and of course, the little gray cells. The investigation begins now. Chapter 1. The tragic death at Cavendish Club. It was a fine autumn afternoon in London, the kind that lent itself to idle pleasures and quiet indulgences. The well-heeled gentlemen of the Cavendish Club reclined in their leather armchairs, sipping brandy, reading newspapers, or engaging in hushed conversations about politics and stock market fluctuations. The club was an exclusive sanctuary for men of status, a place where scandal never entered, at least not in public acknowledgement. That afternoon, however, a most unusual event disturbed the club's genteel routine. It began with a loud, gasping cough from the far corner of the smoking room. A few members turned their heads in mild curiosity, but soon resumed their conversations. Coughing was not uncommon among men who indulged in fine cigars and aged whiskey, but the coughing did not stop. It grew harsher, wetter. Then came the terrible sound of a chair scraping against the polished floor as someone lurched forward. A waiter, trained to be discreet but observant, rushed forward just as the gentleman collapsed against the heavy oak table, knocking over a crystal decanter of port. A half-smoked cigar fell from his hand, landing on the carpeted floor. The man's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. His hands clawed at his throat, his eyes bulging in horror. A strangled, choking sound escaped his lips. Then, with a final shudder, he fell still. The waiter, trembling, reached out hesitantly to check for a pulse. There was none. Sir Bartholomew Edgware, a retired diplomat known for his extensive travels and a taste for fine cigars, was dead. A flurry of motion followed. The club's steward was called. The manager arrived, pale-faced. A doctor, conveniently present in the club, stepped forward to examine the body. The gathered gentlemen murmured in concern, their monocles gleaming with apprehension. Poison was whispered as a possibility, but there was no evidence, no glass or drink specifically touched before the collapse. Only the cigar, which now lay abandoned beside the deceased. The police were summoned, and in due time an inspector arrived, gruff, no nonsense, and determined to see the matter solved with efficiency. But before he could fully take charge, a small, impeccably dressed man stepped forward from among the bystanders. He adjusted his pristine cuffs, smoothed his neatly waxed moustache, and gave the inspector a polite but firm smile. "Might I be of assistance, mon ami?" he asked in a distinctively precise Belgian accent. "For I believe this is not merely a case of unfortunate health, but rather a most deliberate act of murder." Hercule Poirot had entered the affair. Chapter 2. The puzzling circumstances. The smoking room of the Cavendish Club had never been so silent. A man had died, and not just any man, a distinguished diplomat, a figure of wealth and connections. The gentlemen, usually so at ease in their well-appointed surroundings, stood frozen in their tailored suits, their drinks abandoned on polished tables. The scent of tobacco and fine whiskey lingered in the air, but now it was overpowered by something else: fear. Inspector James McLaren of Scotland Yard had arrived promptly, a thick-set man with a broad face and sharp eyes accustomed to detecting deception. His experience had taught him that, despite the veneer of sophistication, crime could fester in even the most privileged circles. He surveyed the room with quiet intensity, before turning his attention to the small, precise figure standing nearby. "Monsieur." "Poirot," he acknowledged. "Didn't expect to find you here." Poirot smiled gently. "Ah, my dear inspector, the unexpected is often the most enlightening. You see, I had just concluded a luncheon engagement nearby when I was drawn here by the commotion. Fate, it seems, has a way of leading one to the most intriguing puzzles. He gestured delicately towards the body. And this, I believe, is indeed a puzzle. McLaren grunted. A heart attack, perhaps. The man was in his 60s. Sudden, but not unheard of. Poirot shook his head, his expression grave. Non, mon ami. There is something most unnatural about his passing. McLaren raised an eyebrow. You suspect foul play? Poirot gave a slight nod and gestured toward the fallen cigar on the carpet. Regardez, the cigar. He had only just begun smoking it, and yet, within moments, he was convulsing, struggling for breath. A coincidence, perhaps, but one must always ask, why this moment? Why now? McLaren turned toward the club's steward, a pale, anxious man named Mr. Withers. Tell me about Sir Bartholomew, the inspector demanded. Was he in good health? Withers hesitated, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. Well enough, sir. He did have some trouble with his lungs now and then. Nothing serious. He was here most afternoons, always in that chair, enjoying a cigar and a glass of port. Routine, you see, he was a man of habits. Poirot's keen eyes gleamed. Ah, habits. They are most revealing, are they not? And tell me, Monsieur Withers, were there any changes to his routine today? Anything unusual? Withers swallowed. No, sir. At least, nothing that I noticed. He hesitated as though something had just occurred to him. Well, there was the matter of the cigars. McLaren frowned. What about them? Well, Sir Bartholomew was particular about his cigars, you see. Always imported from Havana, kept in the club's humidor, but today he didn't take one from his usual supply. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. Comment intéressant. He smoked a different cigar today? Yes, Withers said, shifting uneasily. I noticed when he lit it. The label was different. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now. He trailed off, looking troubled. Poirot exchanged a glance with McLaren. It would seem, Inspector, that the cigar may be of some significance. McLaren sighed, kneeling to pick up the fallen object with a gloved hand. He turned it over, studying the partially burned end. We'll have this examined. Could be poisoned. Poirot nodded approvingly. It is a most reasonable assumption, but we must not allow ourselves to settle too quickly on an answer. Always we must ask, who would want Sir Bartholomew dead? McLaren stood, turning his gaze toward the gentlemen still gathered in the smoking room. That's exactly what I intend to find out. The inspector turned to the club's patrons. I'll need the names of everyone present when Sir Bartholomew collapsed. None of you are to leave until I say so. Murmurs of protest rippled through the room. One man, a tall figure with silver-streaked hair and an aristocratic bearing, stepped forward. Inspector, surely you don't suspect one of us, and you are? McLaren asked. Lord Everingham, the man replied coolly. A lifelong member of this club, as was Sir Bartholomew. I understand you have a job to do, but I do hope you will conduct it with discretion. This club values its reputation, Poirot smiled faintly. Ah, but reputation, monsieur, is often a thing built on secrecy. And secrecy, I find, is most often where murder begins. Everingham's mouth tightened. Are you suggesting that one of us is a murderer? Poirot held up a finger. I suggest nothing yet, but in such a case, it is often wise to consider those who had reason to wish the deceased harm. Tell me, were you a friend of Sir Bartholomew? Everingham hesitated just a fraction too long. We moved in similar circles, he admitted. He was a man of firm opinions. Meaning he had enemies, Poirot prompted. Everingham's gaze flickered. As any man of influence does, Poirot nodded, storing the information away. And who, among his acquaintances, might have wished him ill? Everingham hesitated again, then said, I can think of someone who might have had cause. McLaren leaned in. Who? A man named Geoffrey Radcliffe, Everingham said. Sir Bartholomew ruined him, stripped him of everything. If anyone bore a grudge, it was him. McLaren's eyes narrowed. "Where can we find this Radcliffe?" Everingham shrugged. "That I couldn't tell you. Last I heard he had left London. But men like him don't disappear entirely." Poirot folded his hands, looking thoughtful. "A man ruined by Sir Bartholomew, you say? A ruined man can be a dangerous one, n'est-ce pas?" McLaren nodded. "We'll look into it." He turned back to the gathered gentlemen. "Anyone else have something to say?" There was silence. Poirot sighed, his fingers brushing his mustache. "It is most fascinating, mon cher inspector. In such situations, one finds that men prefer to speak as little as possible. And yet, I suspect there is much more to be learned, if one listens correctly." McLaren exhaled sharply. "We'll start with the cigar. If it was poisoned, that's our method. Then we'll track down this Radcliffe." Poirot gave a small smile. "Ah, but Inspector, do not be so quick to accept. The simplest answer? Let us not forget, murder is rarely so straightforward." With that, Poirot turned and surveyed the room once more. His sharp eyes danced from face to face, noting every expression, every flicker of discomfort. The game had begun, and Poirot had no intention of losing. Chapter 3. The First False Lead. The next morning, Hercule Poirot sat in his impeccably ordered apartment, a cup of steaming chocolate in hand. The events of the previous evening at the Cavendish Club occupied his mind, and he found himself turning them over with the careful precision of a jeweler examining a diamond. Sir Bartholomew's death was not natural, of that he was sure. But the method, the motive, and the murderer? Those remained elusive. Inspector McLaren had sent the cigar for analysis, and the results had arrived that morning. The cigar had indeed been laced with poison, an exotic and fast-acting substance that caused respiratory failure within minutes. Poirot had smiled when he heard the news. It was precisely as he had suspected. And yet, it was too neat, too obvious. At precisely 10 o'clock, a sharp knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Poirot adjusted his mustache with a delicate touch before calling out, "Entrez!" The door opened, and Inspector McLaren strode in, his expression grim. "Poirot, we've got a lead," he announced, dropping a folder onto the detective's polished desk. Poirot regarded it with mild curiosity. And what is this lead, mon cher?" McLaren tapped the folder. "Geoffrey Radcliffe. We managed to trace him to a boarding house in Camden. The landlady says he came in late last night, disheveled and muttering to himself. More importantly, she swears she saw him with a box of cigars." Poirot arched a single delicate eyebrow. "Indeed. And has he been cooperative?" McLaren scowled. "Not in the least. When we brought him in this morning, he refused to answer a single question. But he had one of Sir Bartholomew's cigars in his pocket." Poirot steepled his fingers. "Curious. And yet I sense that you are not convinced," McLaren sighed, rubbing his temples. "Something about it feels too easy. Yes, Radcliffe had a motive. Sir Bartholomew ruined him financially. But that was years ago. He vanished from society. If he wanted revenge, why now?" Poirot nodded approvingly. "Très bien, mon ami. You are learning. The mind of the murderer, it does not work so simply. If Radcliffe had planned such a crime, he would not be so careless as to walk about with the very object that killed his enemy. No. There is something missing here," McLaren exhaled. "I was hoping you'd say that. Would you like to speak with him?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "But of course. It is time we made the acquaintance of Monsieur Radcliffe." At Scotland Yard, Poirot was led to a small, windowless interrogation room. Geoffrey Radcliffe sat at the metal table, his fingers tapping out a nervous rhythm. He was a man in his late 40s, his face lined with bitterness and exhaustion. His suit, though once expensive, was worn at the edges, and his hands bore the telltale stains of ink. A man who once wrote letters of influence, now reduced to writing desperate pleas. McLaren took a seat across from Radcliffe, while Poirot remained standing, observing. "Radcliffe," McLaren began, "you were seen with a box of cigars last night. Care to explain?" Radcliffe let out a short, bitter laugh. "Is that why I'm here? Because I smoke cigars?" McLaren's jaw tightened. "Not just any cigars. The same brand that Sir Bartholomew smoked." Radcliffe's face darkened. "So? What? That pompous old fool was always flaunting his wealth, his superiority. Perhaps I wanted to taste a little of what he took from me." Poirot spoke for the first time, his voice soft but firm. "Monsieur Radcliffe, if you despised Sir Bartholomew so, why return to London now? Why seek out the very thing that would link you to his murder?" Radcliffe met Poirot's gaze, something wary in his expression. "Murder?" he repeated. "So that's what this is about." Poirot inclined his head. "Sir Bartholomew did not die of natural causes, monsieur. And yet, it seems convenient, does it not, that a man who loathed him should suddenly reappear, carrying the very thing that ended his life?" Radcliffe's hands curled into fists. "I didn't kill him." McLaren leaned forward. "Then explain. Where you got those cigars?" Radcliffe hesitated. His eyes darted toward Poirot, who studied him with unwavering intensity. Finally he exhaled. "I was at a pub in Soho last night. A man offered me a drink, said he recognized me. He mentioned Sir Bartholomew, how he had wronged me. He sympathized." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, a most unusual display of kindness, n'est-ce pas?" Radcliffe nodded slowly. "I thought the same. But then he gave me a box of cigars. Said they were a gift." He swallowed hard. "I was desperate. I took them." McLaren frowned. "This man. Did he give a name?" Radcliffe shook his head. "No. Just said he was an old friend of Bartholomew's. But I remember one thing, he had a scar on his left hand. A long, jagged one." Poirot turned to McLaren. "Tell me, Inspector, do you know of any such old friends with a scarred hand?" McLaren rubbed his chin. "None come to mind, but I can check." Poirot nodded. "Do so. And Monsieur Radcliffe?" Radcliffe glanced up. "You are fortunate. Someone wished to frame you, but they did so too clumsily. It tells me that they were either desperate or inexperienced." Poirot's expression darkened. "And desperation, mon ami, is the most dangerous quality of all." As they left the interrogation room, McLaren exhaled sharply. "So, Radcliffe's not our man." Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "No, but we have learned something most valuable. Someone went to great lengths to make it appear as though he was guilty." McLaren nodded grimly. "Which means the real killer is still out there." Poirot's mustache twitched. "Oui, and he is watching. The question is, who?" At that moment, an officer approached them. "Inspector McLaren, we've just received an urgent message from the Cavendish Club." McLaren frowned. "What is it?" The officer hesitated. "Another member, Lord Everingham. He's been found unconscious in the smoking room, and he was holding a cigar." Poirot's expression did not change, but his voice was quiet when he spoke. "Ah, it seems, mon cher Inspector, that the murderer is not yet finished." Chapter 4. The second victim, Hercule Poirot, and Inspector McLaren arrived at the Cavendish Club within the hour. The atmosphere inside had changed since their last visit. The members, once composed and indifferent, were now tense, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting toward the smoking room where the incident had occurred. The murder of Sir Bartholomew had unsettled them, but now there was another victim. Poirot followed McLaren through the club, pausing briefly to observe the patrons. The usual cluster of gentlemen lounged about, some puffing anxiously on their cigars, others speaking in murmurs. A butler passed by carrying a silver tray, his hands visibly shaking. Poirot's keen eyes missed nothing. Fear had crept into the Cavendish Club. As they entered the smoking room, Poirot immediately took in the scene before him. Lord Everingham, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, lay slumped in a deep leather armchair. A half-smoked cigar rested on the table beside him, and a brandy glass had toppled over, spilling its contents onto the carpet. A physician knelt beside him, checking for vital signs. Poirot stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Lord Everingham's face. His skin was pale, his lips slightly blue. His breath was shallow but present. He was alive, but only just. The physician looked up. "He's unconscious, Inspector. It appears to be some kind of poisoning." McLaren's expression darkened. "Same as Sir Bartholomew?" "Too soon to say," the physician replied. "But the symptoms, they match." Poirot bent down, studying the cigar closely. It was the same brand as Sir Bartholomew's. He picked it up delicately, rolling it between his fingers. Then he took out his handkerchief and wrapped the cigar before slipping it into his pocket. "The question, Monsieur McLaren," Poirot said, straightening, "is whether this was meant to be a second murder or a warning." McLaren frowned. "A warning?" Poirot gestured toward Lord Everingham. "He did not die. That is significant. The poison, if there was poison, was not as strong as before. Either the murderer wished only to frighten him, or they made a mistake." McLaren glanced toward the club manager, Mr. Whitaker, who hovered anxiously near the doorway. "Who was the last person to speak with Lord Everingham?" Whitaker wrung his hands. I believe it was Colonel Armitage. They were discussing some business matter before Everingham sat down to smoke." Poirot turned his sharp gaze to McLaren. "Then I believe it is time we spoke to Colonel Armitage." Colonel Armitage was found in the card room, sitting stiffly, at a table with a glass of whiskey in front of him. A seasoned military man. His face was ruddy, his expression stoic, but there was an undeniable tension in the set of his jaw. McLaren wasted no time. "Colonel, what did you and Lord Everingham discuss before he fell unconscious?" Armitage swirled his whiskey, watching the liquid move. "Nothing of great consequence. We were speaking of Sir Bartholomew's death, as was everyone." Poirot studied him closely. "And you did not see him take the cigar?" "I didn't notice," Armitage admitted. "But he did mention something strange before he sat down." Poirot leaned in. "Ah. And what was that?" Armitage hesitated, then said, "He told me he had remembered something about the night Sir Bartholomew died. Something he had overlooked before." Poirot exchanged a glance with McLaren. "And did he say what this thing was?" "No," Armitage said, shaking his head. "He seemed troubled. He said he would tell me later. But now—" He glanced toward the smoking room. Poirot clasped his hands behind his back. It would appear someone did not want him to remember. McLaren muttered a curse under his breath. "If Everingham survives, we'll find out what he meant, but if he doesn't—" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then we must work quickly, n'est-ce pas?" Leaving the card room, Poirot turned to McLaren. "Mon ami, we must consider what we have learned." McLaren sighed. "We've learned that whoever killed Sir Bartholomew is still active, and that they're getting desperate." Poirot smiled faintly. "Just so. But we have also learned something else." McLaren raised an eyebrow. Poirot tapped his temple. "Someone gave a poisoned cigar to Sir Bartholomew. Someone ensured that Lord Everingham received another. But consider, both men were members of this club. Both had known each other for years. And now, both have been targeted." McLaren rubbed his chin. "So the killer is someone within the club." Poirot spread his hands. "What else could it be? Someone who knows the habits of these men. Someone who knew that Everingham had recalled something important." McLaren scowled. "But who?" Poirot turned toward the entrance of the club, where the butler from earlier was still lingering. His hands were still shaking. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "The staff," he murmured. "They see all. They hear all. McLaren followed Poirot's gaze. "You think the butler knows something?" Poirot nodded. "Let us find out." The butler, a nervous man by the name of Mr. Graves, fidgeted under Poirot's keen scrutiny. "I swear, sir, I don't know anything about the poisoning." Poirot tilted his head. "But you have noticed something. You are afraid, monsieur." Graves hesitated, glancing around. "It's not my place to speak." Poirot smiled gently. "Ah, but it is precisely your place, my good man. You serve these gentlemen. You see what others do not." Graves swallowed hard. Then, in a whisper, he said, "I heard Lord Everingham arguing with someone last night, just before he left the club." Poirot's interest sharpened. "Arguing? With whom?" Graves shook his head. "I don't know. I only caught bits of it. Something about debts." Poirot and McLaren exchanged glances. McLaren pressed, "What kind of debts?" Graves looked miserable. "Gambling debts. Sir Bartholomew, Lord Everingham, and a few others. They played for high stakes." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And if one were to lose more than they could afford?" Graves hesitated. "It's happened before." Poirot turned to McLaren. "A man in desperate need of money will do desperate things, mon ami." McLaren nodded grimly. "And we need to find out just how desperate someone was." As they left the butler, Poirot's mind was racing. A pattern was emerging, but it was not yet complete. Sir Bartholomew was dead. Lord Everingham had nearly followed. Both men had been involved in high-stakes gambling, and someone had wanted to silence them. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "We must move quickly, Inspector, before another gentleman finds himself with a most unfortunate cigar." Chapter 5. The shadow of debt, the dimly lit corridors of the Cavendish Club whispered with unease as Poirot and Inspector McLaren moved with quiet purpose. The revelation of gambling debts had shifted the investigation into dangerous territory. Money was a powerful motive, perhaps the most powerful of all. Poirot paused in front of the smoking room, where a doctor now tended to Lord Everingham. The man remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but stable. The physician glanced up and shook his head. "He will live, but I cannot say when he will wake." Poirot nodded, pressing his fingertips together. "Then we must work without his testimony, for now." He turned to McLaren. "We must know more about these debts, mon ami. Who owed? Who paid? Who could not afford to lose?" McLaren sighed. "I know just the man who might help. Cavendish Club has a reputation for discretion, but gambling leaves its traces. There's a bookkeeper in the club, a Mr. Redfern. If records exist, he'll know." Mr. Redfern's office was a small, windowless room tucked away from the grandeur of the main hall. The man himself was tall and thin, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and ink stains on his fingers. He looked up as they entered, adjusting his glasses warily. "Good evening, gentlemen. I assume you're not here for a game of bridge?" McLaren crossed his arms. "We're here about debts, Redfern. Sir Bartholomew and Lord Everingham. What can you tell us?" Redfern hesitated. "I keep records, but they are confidential." Poirot stepped forward, his voice smooth. "Monsieur, 2 men have been poisoned, 1 fatally. Discretion, I think, is no longer the priority." Redfern exhaled sharply, then reached for a leather-bound ledger. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a section marked with neatly penned names. His finger traced a line. Sir Bartholomew had substantial gambling debts, Redfern admitted. He was reckless in his bets, lost more than he won. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And Lord Everingham?" Redfern nodded gravely. "The same, but there is more." He hesitated, then sighed. There was a third man. Poirot leaned in. "And his name?" "Mr. Gerald Ashcombe." McLaren frowned. "Ashcombe, the businessman? He's well off, isn't he?" Redfern pursed his lips. "You would think so, but the truth is, Ashcombe's finances have been in trouble for months. He tried to recover through gambling. Poirot's mustache twitched. And instead he lost. Redfern nodded. A great deal, enough to ruin him. Poirot tapped the edge of the ledger. Tell me, monsieur, did Sir Bartholomew, Lord Everingham, and Ashcombe have dealings together outside of their games? Redfern hesitated, then lowered his voice. There was talk. They had some kind of private arrangement, a business venture of sorts. But something went wrong. Ashcombe became desperate. McLaren's eyes darkened. And now 2 of them have been targeted. Poirot's mind was already working. A triangle had formed. 3 men bound by secrets, by money, by something larger than mere gambling. If Ashcombe had been the most desperate, was he now the most dangerous? Poirot straightened. We must speak to Monsieur Ashcombe at once. They found Gerald Ashcombe in one of the private lounges, nursing a glass of brandy. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with sharp features and a tense expression. At their approach, he set down his drink and forced a thin smile. Inspector, Monsieur Poirot, I suppose I should not be surprised to see you. Poirot sat gracefully across from him, studying the man's posture, the stiff shoulders, the restless hands. Monsieur, you were close to Sir Bartholomew and Lord Everingham, were you not? Ashcombe gave a tight nod. We played cards together, had business dealings. McLaren's voice was firm. We know about the debts, Ashcombe. Ashcombe's jaw tightened. If you're asking whether I had reason to want them dead, then no. My financial troubles are no secret. But murder? That is not my style, gentlemen. Poirot steepled his fingers. And yet, mon ami, Sir Bartholomew is dead. Lord Everingham nearly followed. And you? Well, you are the last man left standing in your circle of debt. Ashcombe's fingers gripped the armrest. I swear to you, I had nothing to do with this. Poirot regarded him for a long moment. Then, softly, he said, Did Lord Everingham speak to you last night before he was poisoned? Ashcombe hesitated. He did. And what did he say? Ashcombe swallowed. He told me he remembered something about the night Sir Bartholomew died. Something important. He was going to tell me later, but Poirot leaned forward. But someone made sure he could not. Ashcombe's face paled. You think? He trailed off, glancing around. Poirot's voice was gentle but firm. I think that whoever poisoned Sir Bartholomew is trying to silence those who know too much. And you, monsieur, you may be next. Ashcombe ran a hand through his hair. Good God, Poirot stood. If you wish to remain alive, monsieur, you must be truthful with us. What was this business arrangement you had with Sir Bartholomew and Lord Everingham? Ashcombe hesitated, then exhaled. It was an investment. Scheme, a risky one. We put money into a venture overseas, a mining operation. But it failed. The money was gone. Sir Bartholomew tried to recover his losses through gambling. Everingham too. And I was already ruined. Poirot nodded, the puzzle shifting into place. And there was someone else involved, was there not? Ashcombe's eyes flickered. The man who convinced us to invest. Poirot's voice was like silk. His name, monsieur. Ashcombe hesitated. Then, with a defeated sigh, he said, Jonathan Reeves. McLaren's brows shot up. Reeves, the financier? Ashcombe nodded. He set up the deal, took his cut, and left us with the losses. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. And now, 2 of his former investors have been poisoned. A silence hung between them. Then, McLaren muttered, I think it's time we had a word with Mr. Jonathan Reeves. Poirot, however, remained still. His mind was already moving ahead, piecing together the threads of deception. The question was no longer just who had the most to lose. but who had the most to gain? Chapter 6. The Man in the Shadows. The revelation of Jonathan Reeves's involvement cast a long shadow over the case. Reeves was not merely a financier. He was a man known for moving money in ways that left others ruined while he walked away untouched. If Sir Bartholomew, Lord Everingham, and Gerald Ashcombe had been his victims, then two of them had already paid the ultimate price. Poirot and McLaren wasted no time. That evening, they arranged a meeting with Reeves at his private club, the Mayfair Gentlemen's Society, a place where wealth and influence mingled over expensive cigars and well-aged port. It was an establishment far more refined than the Cavendish Club. Here, one did not gamble with cards, but with fortunes. As they stepped into the grand oak-paneled lounge, Poirot took in the quiet murmurs of business dealings, the rustling of newspapers, and the occasional clink of crystal glasses. Jonathan Reeves sat by the fireplace, a heavy tumbler of brandy in one hand, his dark eyes sharp and watchful. He was a man in his early 60s, his graying hair slicked back with precision, his suit impeccably tailored. He exuded confidence, but Poirot noted the slight tension in his posture. "Ah," Reeves said as they approached. "Inspector McLaren and Monsieur Poirot, is it? I must say, your reputation precedes you." Poirot inclined his head. "It often does, monsieur." McLaren took a seat opposite Reeves without invitation. "We need to talk about Sir Bartholomew Strange and Lord Everingham." Reeves sipped his brandy, feigning mild interest. "Tragic business, that. I read about it in the papers." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet, monsieur, you were acquainted with both men. Surely their deaths come as more than just tragic business to you." Reeves sighed, setting down his glass. "I won't deny knowing them. We had financial dealings in the past." McLaren scoffed. "You mean you convinced them to invest in a scheme that cost them everything?" Reeves arched a brow. "It was an opportunity, gentlemen. Investments carry risks. They knew that." Poirot studied him carefully. "Perhaps, but one wonders. When these gentlemen lost their fortunes, did that not trouble you?" Reeves smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. "One does not survive in finance by being sentimental, Poirot." Poirot nodded slowly, then asked, "Tell me, monsieur, did either Sir Bartholomew or Lord Everingham threaten to expose you? To make your dealings public?" Reeves's expression darkened slightly. "I deal in contracts and agreements. Nothing I do is illegal. If they had made allegations, they would have been laughed out of any serious financial circle." McLaren leaned forward. "And yet, Reeves, it seems convenient that they were both poisoned. One has to wonder if their deaths benefited someone who wanted past deals buried." Reeves met his gaze evenly. "Are you accusing me, Inspector?" Poirot's voice remained light. "Not at all, monsieur. But you see, I have an affinity for patterns, and I see a pattern here. 3 men lost a fortune. 2 of them are now dead, and you remain unscathed." Reeves smirked. "I suppose some might call that luck." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Or strategy, monsieur." A silence stretched between them. Then Reeves sighed and picked up his brandy again. "You are persistent, Poirot. I will give you that. But I assure you, I had no reason to harm either man. I have no need for vengeance or retribution. My fortune remains intact." Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. "Indeed. And yet, one wonders. What of Gerald Ashcombe? He too was ruined by your dealings, and yet he still lives." Reeves shrugged. "Perhaps the killer dislikes odd numbers." Poirot smiled thinly. "Or perhaps, monsieur, Ashcombe simply has not yet been targeted." McLaren stiffened at that thought, while Reeves only chuckled. "Then you'd best keep an eye on him, Inspector." Poirot did not reply immediately. He studied Reeves for a long moment, then rose. "One final question, monsieur. do you smoke cigars? Reeves blinked, caught off guard. Cigars? What has that to do with anything? Poirot smiled pleasantly. Humor me, Reeves exhaled. On occasion, yes. A Cuban now and then. Nothing excessive. Poirot inclined his head. Merci, monsieur. That will be all for now. As Poirot and McLaren stepped out onto the street, McLaren muttered, "What was that about cigars?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "A thread, mon ami. One that I must follow carefully." McLaren sighed. "Reeves is a slippery one. If he's behind this, we'll need more than suspicions." Poirot nodded. "Oui, and that is why we must look elsewhere, to the next move our killer will make." McLaren frowned. "You think there will be another attempt?" Poirot's gaze was steady. "If the pattern holds, yes. And I fear for Monsieur Ashcombe." McLaren swore under his breath. "Then we need to act fast." Poirot tapped his chin thoughtfully. "Oui, but not just fast, intelligently. We must predict the killer's move before they make it." McLaren straightened. "So what's our next step?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "We set a trap, mon ami, and we wait for the murderer to fall into it." Chapter 7. The Trap is Set. The following morning, Poirot and Inspector McLaren arrived at Gerald Ashcombe's residence, a modest yet tastefully furnished townhouse in Kensington. The man who greeted them was not the broken figure Poirot had expected. Ashcombe, though aged beyond his years, still carried himself with the dignity of a man who had once held great influence. His silver hair was neatly combed, his tweed suit precisely tailored, but his deep-set eyes held a wariness that spoke of past defeats. "You wish to discuss the murders?" Ashcombe said as he led them into his sitting room. His voice was calm, but Poirot detected a certain tightness in it, a controlled anxiety. "Oui, Monsieur Ashcombe," Poirot replied, settling into an armchair with careful precision. "You were acquainted with both Sir Bartholomew and Lord Everingham, were you not?" Ashcombe sighed, pouring himself a brandy. "More than acquainted. We were friends, once." McLaren took out his notebook. Friends who were financially ruined by the same man. Ashcombe's hand tightened around his glass. "If you mean Jonathan Reeves, you are correct. That man, he took everything from us, promised us a grand venture, spoke of fortunes to be made. We were fools to trust him." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Monsieur, were you aware of any attempts by Sir Bartholomew or Lord Everingham to expose Reeves?" A bitter smile crossed Ashcombe's lips. "Expose him? We had no proof. He ensured that everything was done within the bounds of legality, however immoral it may have been. But I do know that Everingham had been speaking of a certain document, a contract or letter, something that might have implicated Reeves. Whether it truly existed or was merely wishful thinking, I cannot say." Poirot exchanged a glance with McLaren. "A document, you say? And did Sir Bartholomew believe in its existence?" Ashcombe nodded. "Yes. I last saw him a week before. His murder. He told me he was considering confronting Reeves with whatever proof Everingham had. I warned him it was a fool's errand." McLaren frowned. "Do you believe Reeves could have had them killed?" Ashcombe exhaled slowly. "Reeves has always been ruthless, but murder, that is a different matter entirely." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And yet, Monsieur Ashcombe, you must be aware that if there is indeed a pattern to these killings, you may very well be the next target." A flicker of something unreadable passed across Ashcombe's face. "Yes," he admitted. "I have considered that possibility." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Then you will not object to our protection. Inspector McLaren and his men will keep watch over your home, and I myself will remain close at hand." McLaren blinked. "Wait, you mean to stay here?" Poirot smiled. Not in so many words, mon ami. But I will not be far. Let us say, I wish to see what happens next." Ashcombe gave a short, humorless laugh. "You believe the killer will strike again?" Poirot's expression was unreadable. "I believe that if we are patient, we shall have our answer soon enough." That evening, a quiet tension settled over Ashcombe's residence. Two plainclothes officers stationed themselves outside, keeping watch on any comings and goings. Inside, Ashcombe attempted to go about his evening routine, but Poirot could see the strain in his manner. He drank a little too much, checked the locks twice, and started at every unexpected sound. Poirot, meanwhile, occupied himself with a book, appearing perfectly at ease in his armchair. "You must not let the anticipation distress you, monsieur," he said lightly. "Fear is what the murderer wants." Ashcombe shook his head. "It is not fear, Poirot. It is the uncertainty." Midnight approached. McLaren, seated nearby, yawned. "If the killer plans to strike, they're taking their time." Poirot did not respond. His attention was fixed on the mantelpiece, where a cigar box sat prominently. He had noticed earlier that Ashcombe did not smoke cigars, yet the box had been left open, as though recently used. He rose and inspected it. "Monsieur Ashcombe, these cigars, do they belong to you?" Ashcombe looked over, frowning. "No, they were a gift, a rather unwelcome one." "From whom?" Poirot's voice was suddenly sharp. Ashcombe hesitated. "A package arrived 2 days ago. No name, only my address." Inside were these cigars. McLaren stood abruptly. "And you didn't think to mention this?" "I assumed it was some acquaintance trying to make amends," Ashcombe said defensively. "I had no intention of smoking them." Poirot picked up one of the cigars, turning it carefully in his fingers. "Did either Sir Bartholomew or Lord Everingham smoke cigars, monsieur?" Ashcombe's face paled. "Everingham did. He was rarely seen without one. And Bartholomew, occasionally at gatherings." Poirot nodded. "Allure, the pattern emerges." He turned to McLaren. "Inspector, I believe we have our murder weapon." McLaren blinked. "You think the cigars are poisoned?" Poirot gave a small smile. "I do not think, mon ami. I know." McLaren swore under his breath. "Then we need to get them tested immediately." Poirot placed the cigar back into the box. "Oui, but more importantly, we must consider who sent them?" Ashcombe swallowed hard. "Do you believe they came from Reeves?" Poirot tapped his chin. "It is a possibility, but I am not yet convinced." McLaren frowned. "Then who else?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The one person we have not yet truly considered. The one who hides in plain sight." Ashcombe stiffened. "You mean?" Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, monsieur. The time for revelations is near. But first, we must spring the trap." Chapter 8. Poirot's little experiment. Poirot's declaration sent a wave of silence through the room. Inspector McLaren exchanged a glance with Ashcombe, both visibly uneasy. The presence of the cigar box, an ominous, silent threat, hung over them like a guillotine waiting to fall. "You believe the killer intends to strike again?" McLaren asked, his voice low. Poirot smoothed the cuffs of his impeccably tailored sleeves. "No, mon ami, I do not believe. I know." McLaren ran a hand through his hair. "And yet you won't tell us who you suspect?" Poirot smiled. "Not just yet, mon cher. First, I must be sure. That is why I propose a small experiment." Ashcombe's fingers drummed against his armchair. "An experiment?" Poirot lifted the cigar box and turned it in his hands. "It is very simple. You will host a gathering tomorrow evening, Monsieur Ashcombe. A final toast to your fallen friends. And bien sûr, you will offer these cigars to your guests." McLaren's brows shot up. "That's madness. If they're poisoned..." Poirot held up a finger. "Non, non, my dear inspector. We shall ensure that no one actually smokes them. But we must see how the sender reacts when they see their gift offered so freely." Ashcombe's expression darkened. "You want to lay a trap?" Poirot nodded. Exactement. The murderer believes they have control, that they alone dictate the game. But now, we shall shift the pieces upon the board. McLaren crossed his arms. You're banking on the fact that the killer will give themselves away. That's a big gamble. Poirot's gaze was sharp. Gambling is for fools. Mon ami, I do not gamble, I calculate. Ashcombe hesitated, but then gave a curt nod. Very well. I'll make the invitations. Poirot beamed. Excellent. And now, mes amis, we wait. The following evening, Ashcombe's residence transformed into a place of subdued revelry. The Ehor drawing room, usually a quiet sanctuary, buzzed with cautious conversation. The guest list, carefully curated by Poirot, included Jonathan Reeves, Dr. Langley, Mr. Phelps, Lady Everingham, and a few other acquaintances of the late Sir Bartholomew. Reeves, ever the composed businessman, swirled his whiskey as he surveyed the room. A rather grim sort of gathering, wouldn't you say, Ashcombe? Ashcombe gave a forced smile. A tribute, Reeves, to old friends. Reeves took a sip, his eyes calculating. And to new beginnings. Poirot, standing near the fireplace, observed everything with quiet intensity. He noted how Dr. Langley avoided looking directly at the cigar box on the mantel, how Mr. Phelps's fingers twitched every time someone mentioned the murders, how Lady Everingham's lips pressed into a tight line whenever her late husband's name was spoken. Finally, at the appropriate moment, Ashcombe lifted the cigar box and opened it with a flourish. Before we end the evening, a small indulgence. A fine cigar, gifted to me recently. He extended the box toward Reeves. Care for one? Reeves hesitated only a fraction of a second before chuckling. Ah, no thank you. I never smoke. Cigars. Bad for business, you see. Poirot's eyes flickered. That at least was true. Reeves had never been known to smoke. Ashcombe turned to Phelps. The man's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. I don't smoke either. Poirot nodded slightly to himself. As he had suspected. Dr. Langley, however, took a step back. His voice was strained. You should dispose of those, Ashcombe. Murmur ran through the room. Lady Everingham shot him a sharp glance. Why? Langley's lips parted, then closed. Poirot's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. Yes, doctor. Why? Langley swallowed hard. Because I recognize the brand. It's cheap, not worth the risk. McLaren stepped forward. A rather specific concern, Doctor. You wouldn't happen to know more, would you? Langley's hands curled into fists. This is ridiculous. Poirot turned fully toward him, his gaze almost gentle. But of course, mon cher docteur, you would say that. The room fell into silence. Langley's face had gone pale. Poirot continued, his voice soft but precise. You see, my friends, I have been puzzling over a particular detail, the matter of the cigars. It was too neat, too perfectly placed. The intended victim was meant to be Monsieur Ashcombe, but what if, in truth, the plan had already been used before? Langley shook his head. I don't understand. Poirot's gaze bore into him. You were present when Lord Everingham died, were you not? Langley stammered. I was called in after the fact. Poirot inclined his head. And yet you pronounced the cause of death as a heart attack with remarkable speed. Reeves's eyes narrowed. Wait a moment. You're saying, Poirot's voice turned sharp. I am saying that Lord Everingham did not die of natural causes. He was poisoned, likely through his cigars. And who better to recognize the symptoms? And cover them up than a doctor, gasps rippled through the room. Langley staggered back, his forehead glistening with sweat. This is preposterous. Poirot took a slow step forward. Non, mon ami. It is merely the truth. McLaren seized Langley by the wrist. Dr. Langley, I think we need to have a long conversation at the station. Langley wrenched his arm free, his voice desperate. You can't prove anything. Poirot sighed. Ah, but I can. You see, I took the liberty of having the remaining cigars examined. And what do you think was found? Langley froze. Poirot's voice was almost gentle. A rare but lethal toxin, one that mimics the symptoms of a heart attack. The doctor's face crumpled. Silence stretched across the room. Poirot straightened his cuffs. And thus, mes amis, the puzzle is nearly complete. Chapter 9. Poirot's final test. The heavy silence that followed Poirot's words was thick with tension. The assembled guests, so recently sipping whiskey and exchanging pleasantries, now stared at Dr. Langley with wide eyes. His usual air of professional detachment had shattered. His face was pale, his hands shaking. Inspector McLaren, standing just behind Poirot, shifted slightly, preparing to intervene should the need arise. Langley's lips pressed together in a tight line. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice wavered. "You have no proof, Poirot. Nothing beyond speculation." Poirot steepled his fingers, watching Langley with quiet intensity. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, mon cher docteur. You see, I am never one to make an accusation without proof. That would be most improper, no?" Langley swallowed hard. He glanced toward the door, then at Ashcombe, who was still holding the cigar box, his expression dark with betrayal. "This is nonsense," Langley said again. Poirot ignored the protest and continued. "Let us examine the facts once more. We have two deaths, Lord Everingham and Sir Bartholomew Ashcombe. The first was ruled a natural heart attack, and the second at first glance seemed an accident. But both, I suspect, were the work of a very careful killer, one who knew how to make death appear quite ordinary." Poirot paced slowly as he spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. "Now, let us consider the manner of the first death. Lord Everingham, a man in seemingly good health, collapses one evening after smoking his usual cigar. And who is the first on the scene?" Poirot stopped and turned sharply toward Langley. "You, doctor." Langley's jaw tightened. "I was his physician." "Ah, precisely." Poirot nodded approvingly. "And what better position to be in? You could ensure that the symptoms would be mistaken for a heart attack. You could insist upon the cause of death with such authority that no one would question it." A murmur rippled through the room. Reeves's eyes narrowed. But why? What possible reason would Langley have for killing Everingham? Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, an excellent question, Monsieur Reeves. One that brings us to motive." He turned back to Langley. "You see, I have spoken with a few people in town, those who recall Lord Everingham's final months, and I learned something most interesting." Poirot's voice dropped, and when he spoke again, it was with quiet emphasis. Lord Everingham had become dissatisfied with his will. He intended to change it. Lady Everingham gasped. I didn't know that." Poirot nodded sympathetically. "Indeed, madame. And yet someone else did know. Someone who stood to lose everything should such a change occur." Reeves's brow furrowed. "Langley was never in the will, was he?" Poirot smiled. "Ah, not in the direct sense. But his brother was." McLaren's head snapped up. "His brother?" Poirot's voice was crisp. "Dr. Langley's younger brother, Edward Langley, was deeply in debt. Lord Everingham had promised to provide him with financial assistance, provided that his will remained unchanged. But, mes amis, if Lord Everingham were to alter his will—" Poirot spread his hands. "The money would be lost." Langley's fingers twitched. You have no proof I even knew about that." Poirot's expression did not waver. "Ah, but I do. You see, I visited your brother. He was most distraught, and in his distress he spoke rather freely. He admitted that you were the one who first told him about the potential change to the will." Langley's face drained of color. Poirot pressed on. "And now we come to Sir Bartholomew Ashcombe, another man in possession of a fortune, another man who, I believe, had begun to suspect the truth." Poirot turned to Ashcombe. "Tell me, monsieur, did Sir Bartholomew ever express doubts about Lord Everingham's death?" Ashcombe hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Now that you mention it, yes. A few weeks ago, he said something wasn't sitting right with him, that Everingham had been in better health than anyone claimed." Poirot sighed. "And that, mes amis, sealed his fate. Because if Sir Bartholomew had begun to suspect foul play, it was only a matter of time before he started asking the right questions. And so, our murderer acted once more." Langley's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't have any evidence that I was involved in Ashcombe's death?" Poirot raised a finger. "Ah, but I do. The cigar box." Langley blinked. "What?" Poirot picked up the cigar box and held it out. "Monsieur Ashcombe received these anonymously, did he not? And he placed them in his study, meaning that whoever sent them could not have known if he would smoke one immediately or days later." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But there was one way to be sure. One person who could have suggested he try a cigar that very evening." Reeves inhaled sharply. "The dinner party," Poirot nodded. "Précisément. And who was in attendance that night? Who, I wonder, might have subtly encouraged Sir Bartholomew to partake?" The room fell silent. Langley's lips parted. You can't be serious." Poirot's voice was gentle. "I am always serious, mon ami." McLaren took a step forward. "Dr. Langley, I think it's time we had a more formal discussion down at the station." Langley let out a short, hollow laugh. "This is all circumstantial. A story built on assumptions. I won't be arrested on Poirot's word alone." Poirot smiled. "Ah, that is where you are wrong, Doctor. Because you see, I have taken the liberty of arranging one final test. A test that you have already failed." Langley frowned. "What are you talking about?" Poirot stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The cigars, Doctor. They were never actually tested." Langley's breath hitched. Poirot's expression was triumphant. "And yet, you reacted as though you already knew they were poisoned." A long, tense silence followed. Langley took a step back, his hands twitched, and then, in a blur of movement, he lunged for the fireplace poker. McLaren was faster. In a heartbeat, he grabbed Langley's wrist and twisted it sharply, forcing the poker from his grasp. Langley let out a strangled cry as McLaren shoved him back against the wall. "It's over," the inspector said coldly. Poirot sighed. "Ah, the desperation of the guilty. It is always the same." McLaren secured Langley's wrists. "Dr. Langley, you are under arrest for the murders of Lord Everingham and Sir Bartholomew Ashcombe." Langley slumped. The fight had left him. Poirot turned to the stunned guests. "And so, mes amis, the affair of the last cigar is concluded." Silence stretched through the room. Then, slowly, people began murmuring, the shock of it all settling in. Poirot straightened his cuffs. Another case solved. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Smoke. Inspector McLaren's men escorted Dr. Langley out of the drawing room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The once composed physician had lost all pretense of control. As the heavy doors shut, behind them, silence hung in the air, thick as the smoke that had once curled from the ill-fated cigar. Lady Everingham pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide and disbelieving. "Dr. Langley, all this time?" Her voice trailed off. Poirot inclined his head. "Yes, madame. It is often the case that the most dangerous of criminals are not the coarse villains of fiction, but rather the ones who hide in plain sight, who command our trust." His gaze softened. "And yet, the truth. Ah, it always finds its way to the surface." Reeves, still looking pale, ran a hand through his graying hair. "I can't believe it. I was so sure Langley was above reproach. I thought—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "But of course, You saw through it all, Poirot. The detective gave a small shrug, smoothing the lapels of his impeccably tailored suit. It is my habit, monsieur. The little grey cells, they work ceaselessly. Ashcombe set down the cigar box with a grimace. So it was all about money. Langley was willing to kill to protect his brother's inheritance. Why? Poirot steepled his fingers. And let us not forget, he very nearly succeeded. Lord Everingham's death was accepted without question. Had Sir Bartholomew not suspected something was amiss, had he not received that box of cigars? He gestured to the offending object. We might not be having this conversation at all. McLaren, re-entering the room after ensuring Langley was secured, exhaled deeply. You know, Poirot, I should be used to it by now, but you always manage to pull the rabbit out of the hat at the last moment. Poirot raised a finger. Ah, but it is never magic, mon cher inspector. It is only the method, observation, logic, and a deep understanding of human nature. He paused. And of course, a certain flair for the dramatic. A flicker of a smile crossed McLaren's lips. Lady Everingham sank into a chair. But, Monsieur Poirot, how did you know? From the beginning, how did you suspect it was Langley? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, madam, it was a matter of contradictions. Consider, if you will, the most curious aspect of Lord Everingham's death, his supposed heart attack. A natural cause, yes? And yet there were inconsistencies. The man was in excellent health, no known cardiac troubles. And then there was the cigar. Ashcombe frowned. What of it? Poirot spread his hands. It was an indulgence Lord Everingham enjoyed on occasion, but not to excess. And yet, it was the very last thing he did before his death. The timing. It was too convenient. Reeves nodded slowly. So you suspected poison? Poirot smiled. I suspected at first that something was not right, but I did not yet know how. It was only upon investigating further that I uncovered the true motive. Everingham's planned change to his will. That, mes amis, was the key. Lady Everingham shuddered. And when Sir Bartholomew received the cigars, Poirot nodded. Gravely. A second crime, intended to silence him. You see, our good doctor was clever, but not so clever as he believed. He thought to dispose of one problem in the same manner as the first. But, as I have often said, a murderer who repeats. His method invites suspicion. Ashcombe's brow furrowed. But Poirot, the cigars, how did you know they were poisoned? Poirot's moustache twitched. Ah, mon ami, that is the most delightful part of all. He held up the box. I did not. A stunned silence followed. Reeves gaped. You mean, you didn't test them? Poirot shook his head. Nah. McLaren blinked. Then how? Poirot beamed. A little psychological test, mes amis. You see, Langley revealed himself. The moment I mentioned the cigars being poisoned, he did not question it. A man innocent of such a crime would have demanded proof, protested the claim. But Langley, he panicked. He knew. Poirot's voice dropped slightly. Because he was the one who had sent them. Ashcombe let out a low whistle. Clever. Merci. Poirot inclined his head. It is, as I often say, not always the physical clues that matter most, but rather the reactions of people. The guilty, they always betray themselves. Lady Everingham looked faint. And to think, he was in our home for years. I trusted him. Poirot's expression softened. The betrayal of trust, madam, is often the cruelest crime of all. McLaren folded his arms. Well, it's a solid case. Between his reaction and the motive, the jury won't take long to decide. I'll have men go through his things, if he had access to any poison. We'll find it. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Oh, you will, mon ami. I should think you will find some rather interesting prescriptions among his records. McLaren nodded. I'll get on it. And Poirot, thank you. Once again, you've managed to see the truth where the rest of us were blind. Poirot waved a hand modestly. Ah, it is simply the application of order and logic, but I am always happy to assist. Reeves chuckled, though his expression was still shaken. Remind me never to play cards with you, Poirot. I suspect you'd see through every bluff. Poirot smiled. Mais oui, monsieur. I believe that would be most unwise. With the case solved, the tension in the room finally began to ease. The guests slowly began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Lady Everingham left to compose herself, and Ashcombe excused himself, looking wearied by the evening's revelations. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and turned to Hastings, who had been unusually silent throughout. My dear Hastings, you have been most quiet. What are your thoughts? Hastings shook his head in amazement. I'll never understand how you do it, Poirot. You saw everything so clearly. Poirot chuckled. Ah, mon ami, it is not so mysterious. One must simply learn to observe, to think, and most importantly, to never accept the obvious explanation at face value. Hastings sighed. Even so, I doubt I'll ever match your little grey cells. Poirot patted his arm. Ah, but mon cher Hastings, what would I do without your charming perplexity? You are, as always, an excellent sounding board. Hastings grinned. Glad to be of service. Poirot straightened his tie. And now, mon ami, I believe a cup of hot chocolate is in order. Solving a murder is most exhausting work. With that, the great Hercule Poirot strode from the room, impeccably composed as always. Another case closed, another criminal brought to justice, and behind him, the lingering scent of cigars and secrets finally began to fade.